There is nothing you can do to lose God's love, and there's nothing more you can do to earn it.
Mm.
And so I had to spend some time reflecting on, what does God's love mean to me? What does God's love feel like to me? If I'm not going to earn it, why am I spinning my wheels so fast to do all this for some reason that I don't need to, And so I think I spent some time recognizing and experiencing God's love in its basic level. I am worthy. God loves me. I am worthy. God loves me.
That was the voice of Denise Robinson, the Director of Adult Discipleship at Treach Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound. Welcome to the Life Plus God podcast. I'm your host, Alyssa Robinson, and you heard a little snippet of a discussion around the question, how do I cope with religion burnout? Now, originally, this question was titled, how do I cope with spiritual burnout? But the more that I thought about it and the more that I thought about my experiences with burnout, I thought, when I really lean into spirituality, that feels renewing and refreshing. It's when I get caught up in the institution of religion that I start to get burnt out, and that can trickle over into my faith, into my attitude about people, into all sorts of different things. So I brought Denise in to have a discussion with me. And Denise, thank you so much for being here today and being a part of this really tough conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be perfectly candid, I agreed to do this because I experienced it more than once myself.
Yeah. What do you think about this whole religion burnout versus spiritual burnout? Did you have the same thought?
Because I have worked in ministry for my entire adult life, a lot of times they overlap. But I do know that people think of spirituality and religion as very different. And I agree with you that spiritual practices are supposed to be a time of connection and growth. And so really and truly, it's the other stuff that leads us to burnout.
Well, okay. For our listeners who might be new to this concept, how would you define religion burnout, and what are some of the common signs to look out for?
First, I'm going to look at burnout. Burnout itself is when you're under pressure to invest energy beyond your resources over and over and over again. And we can experience burnout in a number of ways. But then you add that word religion in it, and all of a sudden, you take on too much of the expectations of your religion that doesn't allow your spirit to rest. When you don't have the resources to do that. And when I mean resources, I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about your capacity. You don't have the capacity to continue doing that over and over and over again. And here's what I know, or I've experienced, that a lot of time, the anxiety of burnout happens when I believe that I'm somehow not living up to God's expectations. And who is placing those expectations on me? I'm placing them on myself, but I also think my religious communities are guiding me in that way too.
Yeah, that's when I was thinking, if we start to think of some of the symptoms of burnout, specifically in religion, I think, one of the things is you're dreading to go to church on Sunday. There's some sort of anxiety in your chest about stepping in that door. And I think that can be a result of burnout, which can stem from a lot of different things. I also think, man, if you're feeling guilt or shame around your faith practice, something's not right there. And I don't know if that is specifically, for some people it's burnout and it is putting like the pressure and expectation on yourself, or the community putting that pressure and expectation on you. So I don't want to discredit. There are people who are like genuinely hurt by the church, who have been rejected by their church community. And that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about sometimes there's this immense pressure of, am I serving enough? Am I giving enough? Am I praying enough? Am I involved in enough groups? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? There's always more work to be done. Am I allowed to rest? Am I allowed to say no to things? Because we have this kind of, I don't know, especially for women, I think this like 1950s housewife mentality in the church of like, you are to be everything to everyone. And anytime there's a chance to step in and help, it is your duty to step in and help.
And I think you're right. I think some of the symptoms, like you said, is not desiring to go to the place that you used to find comfort, but it can be even deeper than that. Maybe it's ignoring any connection at all with God that you used to have regular connection with God. It can be not feeling any restfulness in practices that you used to love doing, even simple little things. And then, of course, when you work at a church, it's even more complicated because it's not wanting to go to work. I mean, the voices in my head, before I even realized that I was experiencing burnout, the voices in my head were very much like what you're talking about. I was saying to myself, you could be doing more. I was saying to myself, or you could be doing it better. I was saying to myself, you're not efficient enough, therefore you're not managing your time well enough, and that's why you're not able to do more. Mm-hmm. So all those voices were going in my head. And
I think that there's also, I put everything I have into this and it wasn't successful, in air quotes. And of course, using this culture that we live in standard of what is success and applying it to a church. Oh, well, if not enough people came, then it wasn't successful. If not enough people were impacted by it, then it wasn't successful. I think that we get caught up in all of that, and that leads to burnout when we're creating this idea of what is it to be a successful church community.
Yeah, we're trying to put definition to everything. You mentioned, I don't pray well enough. Well, then all of a sudden what you're doing is trying to come up with the exact formula, and you're spinning out of control to try to find out the formulas. And it takes a while to realize, wow, this has led me to where I don't even want to do anything, which is when you realize I have religion burnout because I've done too much. And now I'm spiraling out of control. It's not easy to recognize that it's burnout because particularly if being a part of a church community has been something near and dear to you for most of your life, it's hard to recognize what it is I'm experiencing.
Mm-hmm. And it can be painful.
It can be very painful.
Like for some people, I've had conversations with people that their religion burnout led to them needing to find a new church because their church home that they've been with for maybe 15, 20 years was no longer feeding their soul. And it was like a painful breakup because all of their friends were there, their family, like their kids grew up there. They have like this deep heart connection to this community, but they feel the need to start looking for a new church home because they're not being fed. And I totally understand that. Like you have to, and I say, God be with you on your journey because that is so important to feel like your church home feeds you spiritually and it's something that you're excited to be a part of. And so this experience of burnout can lead to a lot of grief and mourning for people of what they've lost. And it's kind of like you said, you're not feeling the connection you once had, and that can hurt.
Well, and what can cause that to happen can be any number of things. When you're mentioning, maybe you're not being fed anymore by your community, it could also be a values conflict with your community. And that's really difficult to process in your brain. And I'm not talking about just somebody that you disagree with, but it's when you realize that your chosen religious community doesn't even think remotely the way you do and isn't even willing to talk about it. That can be a huge values conflict that can really lead people into burnout.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we go into trying to control it, trying to fix it, trying to do everything. We are just running ourselves ragged, trying to reclaim that connection that we once had, which takes us even deeper into burnout because we're not taking the time to rest.
Well, and lack of control is one of the I can't think of the word, but it's not a symptom. It's something that will cause you to spiral into burnout. If you're feeling like you have lack of control, that happens in any kind of burnout. Workplace burnout, religion burnout, any kind. You feel like you have total lack of control, and that can lead you down the road. It's not going to be the sole cause, but it can lead you down the road to burnout.
Obviously, it sounds like you have a lot of personal experience with burnout. You know all of the feelings that come with it. Can you share your journey and experience with religious burnout and what contributed to it? And how did you realize you were in it?
Sure. I've had religion burnout at various times in my life, but the most significant one just happened 4 years ago. And so that's fresh on my mind. And it just so happened that I did some journaling. So I even brought my journal today. It's sitting in front of me now.
I'm doing the math on that. And 2020 is ringing in my ears.
Yes. Isn't it interesting?
Maybe a lot of people experienced that burnout at the same time. And we are still recovering from it.
Yeah. And here's the interesting thing. So my burnout started during COVID. I didn't recognize it. So remember, things shut down in March of 2020. In my workplace at the church, we were back in the office by June, I believe. And so we didn't have that much time at home. We were still working at home, but then we were back in the office. So I was still back in community. We were having outdoor worship. So things they were not normal, but they were returning. And I didn't realize I was burned out until January of 2021. Yet I look back now and realize I was burned out that entire time. And my actions were reflecting it, and I didn't even realize it to myself.
How did you recognize that it was religious burnout and not work burnout?
Well, first of all, I was filled with discontent. I was filled with discontent, and I was trying to find who to blame that discontent on. I had a difficult relationship with somebody during that time, and so that's where all my blame went, is to that difficult relationship. It's like, oh, it's not me. It's not something that I'm experiencing. It's just this difficult relationship. And so I actually had to sit down and think about that for a little bit. Wait a minute. This difficult relationship isn't even consuming my every minute. Why am I so focused on blaming that as what's going on inside? And so I actually had to start looking at my environment. And what I realized was, again, I said this already, I had lack of control. None of us predicted 2020. None of us knew when it was going to end. There was so many things beyond our control. Even making a simple decision of when are we going to come back to church took a large body of people at our church to make a decision. And it wasn't, let's talk about this. Okay, June 5th, we're going to have outdoor, it was a deep, hard discussion that was filled with lack of control. This is something that I think happens in religion burnout, insufficient reward. And so
that I do remember from that time of like we were just trying anything and to help people because people were locked down in their homes and like we were all just trying to survive, not to mention grow spiritually. And so we were doing everything that we could to try to connect with people, try to make them feel hope, try to remind them that they're still loved, that they're still cared for, even though we can't be in the same room together. And there was just, it felt like everything that we tried fell flat because there was a lack of in-person community that was so needed. And we all just felt like little islands.
Yeah. And insufficient reward is interesting because you're not getting those endorphins from things working well, but at the same time, you start feeling guilty because you're a Jesus follower and you're not supposed to be doing this for the reward. You're supposed to be doing this to share the love of Jesus. And it doesn't matter if it's just one.
Yeah.
It's important. And so the insufficient reward leads you down a path of guilt.
Of shame.
And shame.
Yeah.
Because you're even thinking that way. The workload at that time for us, those of us that worked in church world, the workload increased immensely, just like you were saying, because we were trying to pivot and do everything differently. It wasn't that the technology was new to us. It was the technology was new to our community in us providing that. And so we had to ramp up and try to get people connected. And we were having conversations constantly and figuring things out. And I was working at home, and even at home, I was putting in 12-hour days. And it was, and in addition to that, guess what I was doing on top of 12-hour work days? Mm-hmm. I was listening to every single podcast that I could about how are other churches handling that.
Webinars. And
what can I do? How, and so I was playing the comparison game. Mm-hmm. Oh, we're not doing this. We need to do that. Oh, look at this church. Their entire church went and did a party for the nurses. We haven't done anything. It was just this spiraling out of control of comparison, insufficient reward, the breakdown of community.
I think that one of the unique things, as you've already mentioned, with working at a church is that this burnout at work leads to spiritual burnout because spirituality feels like a job. Mm-hmm. And that's a really difficult place to be in. And so it's more likely to happen when you work at a church because literally it is your job to help other people grow in their faith and spirituality. But I think that for anyone listening, when spirituality starts to feel like a job and starts to feel like work, maybe that's a cue of take a step back and remember to rest. Like I am convinced rest is a spiritual practice.
Well, and it's interesting because as you were talking about that, the other time I had religion burnout, I was a volunteer.
Yeah.
And so I also know that it doesn't matter whether you're employed by a religious community or whether you're just serving God, that burnout can happen.
How did it feel different as a volunteer? What led to that?
I think as a volunteer, what felt different is I could more quickly say no than when it's your job.
Did you feel like you could say no as a volunteer?
I got to that point. I mean, it wasn't overnight, but I got to that point where I could say, wait a minute, I am not able to perform at this level that you've invited me to perform at. And so that was hard. But I also, again, I had an excuse because I had children at home and I could use that as my children need me. And they did. But at the same time, you still feel like I'm not doing enough. And as a high performer, I put a lot of pressure on myself, both as a worker, as a church worker, and as a high-performing volunteer.
And as a mom.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I also think that the church can contribute to the burnout of volunteers because it is first of all, it's extremely difficult to recruit volunteers. Like one of the hardest things in any nonprofit or church, recruiting volunteers is tough. And I don't want to put any guilt or shame on people who aren't volunteering. I get it. Like you have a full-time job, you have kids at home, you have all of these activities outside. If you have 4 hours on a Saturday to rest, you want to rest and you deserve to rest. I understand that. You don't want to be, spending that time volunteering. And I understand that. I know that as a church, sometimes we're guilty to continue going back over and over and over again to the people who say yes.
Well, that's true. We do that, but we also...
Because so few people say yes.
Right. But we're also talking about what Jesus taught us and what we teach, which Jesus did teach us, is to love God and love people. And then we take it one step further on. What does loving people look like? It looks like on your Saturday, instead of resting, you should be out feeding the houseless, or you should be going over here to do this, or you should be doing that, or you should be leading this, or it's all about doing. Mm-hmm. And we talk a lot about that in our churches, about how can I be a good Christ follower? And it ultimately ends with the voice that we hear, whether it's said or not, is do more.
Well, and I think that this is where everything starts to get tangled, where religion and culture collide. When I was in therapy, I was dealing with religious burnout. And one of the symptoms for me is I start to see the worst in people, specifically in Christians. And I look around me and I become judgmental and I say, nobody cares. Nobody's volunteering. Nobody wants to help. Imagine if every person who called themselves a Christ follower in the world actually got off their butts and did something. We could end homelessness. We could adopt every child in the world. We could feed everybody. We could do all of these things, but everybody's too lazy and selfish. And it's ugly. It's ugliness inside me. But when I start to get that attitude, I know it's because I'm burned out.
Right.
And I've stopped seeing the good in people. And I can't remember where I was going with that, but
No, and I think that actually gets into the values conflict that I mentioned, that sometimes it can be a values conflict within your community. But in 2020, we were having a world values conflict.
Yeah.
People that had disagreeing views over everything. And it became louder and louder and louder. And to the point where I actually stopped calling myself a Christian and was very intentional about that and started calling myself a Jesus follower, because I didn't like, just like you were saying, I was uncomfortable with how I was seeing Christians characterized. Yeah. And they were characterizing themselves that way. It wasn't anything that was forced upon them. I just didn't like it.
Yeah.
And it was a huge conflict for me.
Well, and so where I remember where I was going was that this is where culture and religion collide, right? So my therapist had talked to me about, as much as we want our faith to shape our culture, that's never the way it goes. It is always in every religion and everywhere in the world, it is the culture that shapes the religion. And I think that we see that in the church too, because in our culture, we've got the American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're resting, you're lazy. If you're not doing, you're falling behind. And there's just this mentality of keeping up with the Joneses, comparing yourself to other people. And we let that creep in to our faith life of when God and Jesus both took Sabbath because they needed that time of rest, and yet we say Sabbath equals laziness.
And I didn't fully understand that.
We don't say that, but that's the subliminal messaging.
Well, I didn't fully understand that until my first mission trip to South Africa. and you were on the trip with me, and we had women. It was a women's trip to South Africa, and we had women from Australia, the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and South Africa coming together for a mission trip. And one of the things that shocked me that I heard over and over and over from the women from the other countries was, you Americans look at your watch all the time. You are so bound by the time. And I'd never thought about that until then. And I suddenly look at, we are. They were much more relaxed. And we were like, look what time it is. We need to go. We need to get the bus. We need to get to the job site.
What's the schedule for the day?
What's the schedule
We're
for
off
the day?
schedule.
Yeah. And it was unique to Americans. And I had never completely understood that. I understood a little because when we lived in New Mexico and interacted with the Navajo reservation, I had the great privilege of being a youth minister to some Navajo youth, and they often talked about your time is not the same as our time. But I didn't quite understand it as an American phenomenon until we went to South Africa.
And obviously, we let that creep into our faith. I mean, in the Methodist church, we joke around of like, if you go 2 minutes over an hour in worship, people will get up and leave, you know?
Yeah.
Do not go over your time slot. And we schedule out worship down to the second of how long each element will take. And I think that structure can also contribute to burnout.
It can.
Because there is a place for like tradition and ritual and liturgy and all of that, of like the rhythm of spirituality, but rhythm is different from scheduling.
It is.
And I think that so often we remove the opportunity for the Holy Spirit to be present because we're so focused on how long is this going to take? I have a soccer game to get to at 12:30, you know? And I think that whether we realize it or not, we are taking away our own rest. We're taking away our opportunity to connect with God, and we're hurting ourselves over and over and over again and sending ourselves into this spiral.
And when I truly realized that it was burnout, I realized the ways in which I connected the most with God, that I found sheer joy in. I found connection with God. I found rest when I was doing it and energy when I was doing it. I did not enjoy it all. And that for me happened to be Bible study. And it just so happens, if you heard at the beginning, I am the director of adult discipleship. And I was leading an immense amount of Bible studies because it was COVID. And I was the one that could easily pull them together, and I wasn't enjoying it at all. I was faking it. And that's when I realized this is a bigger issue. The one thing I used to get energy from, but also gave me calmness, I am wanting to avoid at all costs.
Well, so when you realized that this was happening, how did you get out of it? Like, how did you recenter and step out of burnout? Because I think for a lot of us, it turns into a vicious cycle that we can't step outside of. And we don't know how to stop.
You know, it's interesting because like I said, I pulled out my journal, and two things that I will say is, one, I have a very supportive family, and they were hearing me grumble, and I'm not a grumbler. And so I think they were, I say they, but it's funny looking at my daughter across the way. But
oh yeah, I forgot to tell everybody, in case you didn't know, Denise is my mom.
But and it was interesting because Alyssa and I were tending to grumble together during that time of burnout. But others were like, what's going on? This isn't you. You're usually pretty happy and you're pretty grumbly. Then I'm married to a licensed professional counselor who said, I think you need some help. Then I have a boss, Daniel, the senior pastor of our church, who firmly believes in professional help. And so I actually shared with him something's going on. And he gave me 2 pieces of advice. One, he said, seek out counseling or a spiritual director or both. That was his first piece of advice. And his second piece of advice was, if you're not enjoying Bible study, don't do Bible study. Find something else. Don't feel bad about letting go of something that used to bring you joy. Find something else, another spiritual practice that'll bring you joy. And so I actually heeded both my husband's and my boss's advice, and I did both. I got a spiritual director that I met with a couple of times, and then I also got a coach that through the conversation with the coach is when I actually came to the term, I have religion burnout. And that was so helpful. And the tools that both helped me with were instrumental. And I have them in front of me, and I'll never let go of this because I can refer back to it at any time I want to when I'm feeling, am I heading this direction again?
What were some of those tools?
The biggest thing that I think we went back to is the basics. And this is a statement that I wrote down. There is nothing you can do to lose God's love, and there's nothing more you can do to earn it. Mm. And so I had to spend some time reflecting on, what does God's love mean to me? What does God's love feel like to me? If I'm not going to earn it, why am I spinning my wheels so fast to do all this for some reason that I don't need to, you know? And so I think I spent some time recognizing and experiencing God's love in its basic level. I am worthy. God loves me. I am worthy. God loves me. I already counted. I already mattered to God, and I was already really loved. And so I spent time actually thinking on that. I'm not a big prayer, but so I wrote about it. I focused on joy. That was one of the things they said, focus on joy. Focus on little things. Focus on little things. I remember walking to work because I live across the street from our church, so I actually walk to work. I remember walking to work and being so overwhelmed by the sound of a bird and realizing I hadn't been noticing that for a long time, and I walked the same path every day, and those birds were there. But I had extreme joy in hearing the bird, which connected me to God, which connected me to God's love for me and for all creation. And so that's where it was back to the basics.
Were there new spiritual practices that you tried that you found to be helpful to you? Or was it more of just like trying to pick up your head and pay attention to what's happening around you? I mean, that's what the bird makes me think of, is like, it's the spiritual practice of noticing.
Well, and that's really, you know, Daniel had said, try a different spiritual practice. And I struggled with that because, gosh, that's one of the things I do in adult discipleship is I encourage people with different spiritual practices. And so it was actually nature that became my spiritual practice, which was something that was readily available during COVID. I would go on long walks, and it was helpful to me. And it's just like you said, I changed it from a walk for exercise to a walk for my quiet time with God. Mm. Now, was I having this constant conversation with God? No, I was able to actually quiet my brain and just walk. In fact, often this was my prayer. My prayer was from Psalm 46, which is just be still and know that I am God. And I would just be saying that in my head with every step. Be still and know that I am God. Oh, there's a bird. Mm-hmm. Be still and know that I am God. Oh my goodness. Look at the leaves that are budding. And I found myself noticing and so that was really helpful to me. That doesn't mean that that's a formula for anybody else. And that's what we run into the problem of in our lives is we want someone to say, do A, B, and C. And then when you do it, you're cured. And it doesn't work that way. It's a process.
Well, and I think that, we offer this list of spiritual practices and it's on our website. It's at tmumc.org/practices, where you can go through and see all of I'll use the word, it's silly to me, but the official, spiritual practices that we have said help you grow in your relationship with God. To me, those maybe are just a sampling. It's a smattering of spiritual practices, but they're not the only ones.
Right.
Like, as I mentioned, Sabbath is not listed in our spiritual practices. I guess you could say worship is, but worship does not feel restful to me always, especially if I'm working.
But I also redefine during this time what my definition of worship is, because worship is actually anytime you're honoring God. We offer a worship service. And yes, God is honored during that worship service, but worship is anytime I was honoring God. So guess what? My walks were my form of worship.
Yeah, I think that I had to escape burnout, I had to let go of structure. And one of the things that my therapist challenged me with that I repeat in my head over and over again is hold the tension of the world. Do not be dualistic. Do not see things as right or wrong, black and white, good and evil, true or false. All of these things, all of it can be true. Everything can be true because so much of it is a matter of perspective. And you have to learn to hold that tension because if you can't hold the tension, you will always be fighting your entire life because you will always be adversarial to something. And so for me, I had to it's almost like letting go of the structure, letting go of the organization, and embracing the chaos of the world and seeing that God is in that chaos. God is not, a checklist on a sheet of paper. And so often we try to put God in a box and limit how you can connect with God. And then we wonder, why am I feeling burnt out?
And I think your point is really interesting because you're talking about everything's not black and white. That's not an issue I ever have. I have seen the gray in everything ever since I was a kid. And sometimes that was a problem because people wanted you to think black and white. And I always saw the gray. That was something natural to me. However, I never thought it was okay to have a quiet life. I'm a stay busy person. Gosh, my mind doesn't even stop. My mind goes a mile a minute.
I think that's your ADHD.
It might be, but I'm known as someone that interrupts, and it's very offensive to people. And the reason I interrupt is not to be ugly to them, but my mind is going so fast that I've already gone to the next thing. So I had to realize there's no shame in a quiet life. There's no shame in a quiet life. There's no shame in allowing gray in there. There's no shame in chaos. All of those things are what each person has to identify that they need to recognize and realize. And I started recognizing that since the very beginning, most Christians have lived quiet, ordinary lives. Most Christians were doing everything they did in their normal, everyday life, and they were just as beloved by God as the person that was on the go constantly to the point where they couldn't even hold their head up anymore because they were so exhausted. So that was my journey. In fact, I wrote down Romans 12, 1-2. I love it from the Message version. The Message version says, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. So that is not saying do more for God. That's saying live your life, but remember that God is a part of it.
Yeah.
So a wise person who is sitting across from me right now, named Alyssa Robinson, and also my daughter, said something really, really impactful to me during that time.
I can't wait to hear.
I know. Alyssa, you said to me, Mom, it's okay to be mediocre.
I don't think mediocre is the word I used. I said it's okay to be average.
Was it average?
you
Well, I heard
interpreted it as mediocre.
And basically what I heard was, Mom, it's okay to stop trying so hard. It's okay to be quiet. It's okay to stop and take a breath. It's okay to not be at everything, not do everything, not do more. It's okay to say no. And so that was really powerful to me because it made me realize that that's part of it. And Jesus was the one that said, have your rest. Take your rest. My yoke is light.
Yeah.
Come to me for rest.
Yeah. I think our burnouts are so different because I have no problem with resting. I'm really good at resting, actually. I'm really good at saying no to people. That's how I empower other people to say no because I'm really good at it. I'm good at setting boundaries. Rest has always been very important to me, which is why I see the value in it. Where I struggle is my burnout comes from disillusionment with the church. And like I mentioned earlier, I start to see the worst in people. I start to see the church as an institution that all they're doing is maintaining the status quo. I really get into my head about this macro view of Christianity and how we're getting it wrong. And if Jesus showed up today, he would be completely disregarded by many Christians because he would be too radical, too liberal, too progressive, too all of these things, like unrealistic with the way that he welcomes everybody. And I'm like, man, if Jesus saw what the church has become today, and sometimes I even get in my head about like, I should not have a job at a church. Like, that is not something that should exist. Jobs, like the church should not be having to pay people to do this work. If we were, and so I get caught up in that. And of course, I don't want to talk myself out of a job here because I do like my job.
No, but yeah,
it's this disillusionment. Have you, that's what my burnout looks like. Have you experienced that, or is that unique to personality?
It's leading you to burnout might be unique to personality, but it's interesting because my answer to my disillusionment, when I am disillusioned or when I'm having values conflict or when my answer is to do more. Your answer is to disengage.
Yeah.
And so those are two different reactions to a similar thing. So the root result of me doing more.
Well, my first reaction is to be angry.
Okay.
So first I'm angry and I'm telling everybody, hey, this is a problem. This is a problem. This is a problem. I'm shouting into the void. Sometimes I'm given a microphone to do it, but I'm shouting into the void. And then when I feel like nobody's listening and nobody cares, that's when the burnout sets in. And then I disengage.
And so I have
And it's a coping mechanism for me. If I keep with the anger and I keep engaging, then I will implode.
And so again, what I will do is add more. I'll fake it until I make it. I'll add another study. I'll do this. I'll listen to another podcast or a webinar. And my answer is to do more, which leads to the burnout. Mm-hmm. So yes, and I want to make a really clear point here. Having doubts and burnout are two very different things. I don't think doubts necessarily lead to burnout. I think it is a natural part of our spiritual growth, our faith formation to have doubts. And it's not like you have a doubt about something and you work through that and then you'll never have that doubt again. Those same doubts come back and back and back. I think doubts are what help us to grow. Burnout is something totally different. Burnout is when you have allowed your entire being to be so weary from something, whether it's disillusionment, whether it's overdoing, no matter what it is, you've allowed your entire being to become riddled with anxiety and lack of desire and, all of those things. I think it's very different.
Well, okay. So I feel like we've described very well what burnout is and what it feels like and how we've experienced it. I hope that was relatable. There might be people listening who are going through it right now and they're like, yes, that's what I'm feeling. But the title of the episode is How Do I Cope with It? How do I cope with religious burnout? And so we talked a little bit about spiritual practices, but when you were recovering from burnout, were there any like resources or books or teachings that resonated with you and aided in that healing process? Like a balm for the soul, as people say, for this burnout?
I think that different people would reach for different things. I reached for, because I was challenged to try a different spiritual practice, I reached for a book by Jan Johnson that's on spiritual practices. I don't even know the exact title of the book, but it's already on my shelf. And so I took it off, and that's where I was like, oh, worship can be walking. That can be a spiritual practice. I can be doing this, and that's what was helpful to me to pick that up. I know people that simply reading through a favorite psalm was helpful. I love music, but music isn't something that calms my soul. It actually energizes me. So that wasn't my answer, but I know a lot of people that spent time listening to favorite music and relaxing with that and finding a way to do that. So I don't think there's a one go-to, but I did write down some tips that were helpful to me. One of the tips was learn to say no and not feel guilty about it. You said you have no problem with that and that you're good at setting boundaries. So that might not be on your list, but it's on my list. I had down, look for the joy. That could be really on your list.
Well, that's funny because that's what, when I was going through my divorce, the number one piece, and this was not, religious burnout at this point, but it was just a life upheaval. My therapist told me the number one thing I want you to do right now is follow your bliss. Do what makes you happy. If something brings you joy, do it. Go out and explore and find new things that bring you joy that you've never tried before. And he's like, no shame, try anything, try everything, and just experience the world. And I was like, oh, and it was such great advice that I pass on to other people, but it was wonderful. It was like this, I was elated for months, just saying yes to everything that brought me joy.
And sometimes we forget that those moments of joy are every bit a part of our spiritual being. I have great joy being with my family. We have a great family. We have a lot of fun together. And so when we're having fun, we're not having religious conversations at all, yet everything about it is spiritual. And so recognizing that, again, your normal, everyday walking around life is a gift from God and a gift to God. So that was really important, is looking for the joy. I also found that, and this was eye-opening to me, I'm going to say something that's going to sound so clear and simple, and it was taking time every day for solitude. Now, I love being alone. I actually get more energy being alone than I do from being in a large crowd. So I get a lot of energy from being alone. But what I was doing to myself, I was letting religion tell me that my solitude time had to be filled with prayer or Bible reading or memorization. That's what solitude time was supposed to,
You
or
were
meditation.
looking to be spiritually productive
Yes.
is what you wanted.
Yes. And so I was taught by my spiritual director and my coach that time of solitude can be anything. So back in 2020, I discovered the love of reading again, a book that wasn't about religion. I started reading novels again and reading stories of or nonfiction books about people that I admire, and not pulling out church books to read. And guess what? I found out that's also solitude. And that also was helpful for me to get out of the religious burnout, if that makes any sense.
It does. I think that we have to be careful with solitude because solitude is different from numbing. And I think that we have a tendency when we're alone to engage in numbing behaviors like scrolling our phones or playing Candy Crush or watching TV or whatever it is. And that's more of an escapism. And I think that the practice of solitude is about being fully present in a moment by yourself.
Yes, yes. And it was different. And I learned that, gosh, sometimes it meant lighting a candle and just sitting and watching the flame. I happen to have rekindled my love of watching water. I can sit and watch the movement of water all day long. I'm somebody that is always busy, but I could sit at a lake and just watch the ripples and watch a stick that goes down based on the ripples. I can do that for hours. And so I learned to do that. Where in nature could I sit and watch? I enjoyed watching my grandson on Saturday being absolutely fascinated by watching ants. And I remember back in 2020, I did that too. I sat and watched ants. They are fascinating. And you can watch them for quite a bit of time. And so it's things like that that are quiet. It's okay to have a quiet life.
So coming out of your burnout, did you notice any fundamental shifts in either your belief or value system as a result of your burnout?
I hope I had already done this, but I was quicker to when I have conversations with people, is I was being very careful about saying, that's okay if that's your capacity. When people would say, I would love, because I try to help people find where they can connect. And so if they say, I just don't think I can be a part of a small group right now, I've learned to not push that.
Yeah, you don't take it on as your role to persuade them.
Yes, it's no longer that. I recognize because I recognized it in me, it made me realize others are doing that too.
It sounds like your experience of burnout gave you more compassion for others.
It probably did. That doesn't mean I don't get frustrated out now and then. It's like, oh, the same old people are doing everything. That doesn't mean that I get frustrated, but I'm much more understanding about people serving in a way they have the capacity to, and what their energy allows. I'm getting older, and I recognize that at the end of the day, I'm tired. I'm not going to go volunteer somewhere at the end of the day.
Well, and you're also still working full time.
And I'm working full time.
Yeah.
So
maybe it'll be different once you're retired.
Yeah. And I've given myself permission to not feel guilty about that anymore.
Yeah.
And thereby, I need to give other people permission to not feel guilty about what the church is asking them to do. And so I think that's important for us to recognize, just like you and I experience burnout very differently, to recognize where other people experience closeness with God is very different and very unique, and it's okay, and to celebrate all of that. I think the one thing that's universal to everybody is that seeking the joy. Seeking the joy is something that's universal. I don't think there's anything wrong with each and every one of our ministry, because we're all called to be in ministry in one way or another. I don't think Jesus said, you have to do stuff you hate doing. I think Jesus wants us to do what we're gifted at and what gives us energy so that we can share that joy and love with others.
He did say leave your family behind, though. So
that's a whole nother podcast.
For some people, that'll bring them joy.
That's true.
Not for me, but
I also had to learn, and I think this is helpful for me in ministry too. I also had to learn to catch myself and step out of situations that will lead me right back into the burnout. So those situations where I feel like I'm saying yes. Recently, in preparation for Lent, we were putting out a task sheet of things everybody had to do. And I noticed all of a sudden that my name was on that sheet more than anybody else's. Mm-hmm. And I started getting that same feeling. And then I stepped back and said, wait a minute. I can say no to this one, and I can change how I'm going to do this one. And, I can ask. I asked someone to help me with another one. And so it changed. I recognize that if I just look at this to-do list, I'm going to go right back into that burnout.
Well, and that makes me think of like, where does community come in? I know that sometimes community can put on the pressure and expectation that leads to burnout, but at the same time, community can be a part of the healing process of burnout, of like you said, hey, I'm willing to ask people for help. I'm trying to do better about, saying no to people or being compassionate for other people. Where do you think community plays a part in the healing side of burnout?
I personally believe community is very important because I believe that your community that is open and loving and caring to you are the people that you can be vulnerable with and who can say, oh man, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm here to help you walk through it. And you can say to them, hey, I need to slow my pace a little. And they can say, I'm going to allow you to slow your pace a little. Mm-hmm. And they can step into that. And so I think that's where community can be helpful. Where community can be hurtful is people not allowing you to change. Mm. And like I said at one point that I'm a high performer. And so that expectation may remain even when there's times I can't be a high performer. And so that's not helpful when people don't allow you to change because of the season of your life. And that happens in community too.
That happens in families. That happens everywhere. I mean, we don't deal with change well as a species.
Yeah. And the truth is, I like that term seasons of life because each and every one of us has seasons that we have total capacity and seasons that we have less capacity. And that's okay. That's part of the rhythms that you were talking about.
I think a season can last for years.
It can.
Because I feel like I'm just now coming out of that 2020 fog. Because as I also experienced burnout after 2020, and then my burnout turned into depression. And I experienced depression for a solid year. So I didn't come out of the combination of burnout and depression until the end of 2022. And then 2023, I've just been in recovery. 2023 for me was my year of rest. I was an average employee, according to me. I was not volunteering. I was not doing anything extra at church. Sometimes I wasn't even going to church a lot of the time because I was tired and I just wanted to rest. I spent time at home. I burned incense. I folded origami. I did things that brought me joy and peace and rest for a solid year. And I'm just now in 2024 stepping back into the service of others in different ways. And so I think that in our American mentality, sometimes we're like, okay, I'm experiencing burnout. I'll let this last for a couple months and then get over it and move on. And that's not really how it works. It ebbs and flows, and it's a season, and a season can last for a very long time. And it's okay to sit with it and experience it.
And so one of the things each and every one of us can do is think before we speak. So I don't think there was anything wrong with your church community reaching out to you during that time you weren't going to church and saying, "Hey, Alyssa, we miss you." But if they took it to the next level, I mean, when you say, "Yeah, I just need some rest. And then they took it to the next level and made you feel guilty for not coming to church, that's not helpful as a church community. That just keeps it in religion burnout. So we learn to show love and compassion, but not take it to the next human level. Leave it at love and compassion, which is, "Oh, I'm glad you're taking that time of rest."
Yeah, I think, being careful what you say. I think that if we can just respond in maximum love to everyone that we meet, because one of the things that was really hurtful to me is at the end of last year, I was finally ready to step back into the church again. And I hadn't been going to church for almost a solid year at that point because I was dealing with stuff. I was mentally unwell. There would be on Sunday mornings, I would get fully dressed to go to church, grab my keys to walk out the door, and then have a near anxiety attack at the thought of being in that sanctuary. And I would just put my stuff down and go sit on the couch and cry, because I was experiencing something. I finally got to the point that I was ready to start going to church again. And it was really hard because in a year's time, the church changes a lot. And when I stepped back into the church, it was all people I didn't know, people that I was the new person now. This was not the community that I had known, in 2019. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start going to events and, try and introduce myself to people. So I went to this event that was outside of church, and, someone introduced themselves to me and they said, "Oh, do you go to, Oaklawn?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then the person next to me who had known me for a long time was like, "Well, kind of." I was like, "Oh, I'm a member of Oaklawn." And the person was like, "Yeah, kind of." And that really hurt my feelings because I'm like, I've been really going through a dark time in my life and I'm trying to reconnect, and you're discrediting my presence right now and making me feel like I don't belong, or I used to belong, but I don't anymore. And it was really, and I was raw and I was vulnerable stepping into that space, and it made me not want to go back again.
I had a good friend whose spouse doesn't go to church, and the spouse came to church and the spouse is a believer, but needs a day of rest and chooses to worship differently, but came to church on Easter Sunday, and someone said, "Oh, so you come on Easter, huh?"
Yeah.
Do you think this person has been back?
I've heard the same story with someone who hadn't been to church for a long time, showed up to a community meal, and someone made the comment, "Oh, I see you show up when there's food."
Yeah. Yeah.
How hurtful. Like, you don't know what someone's going through. You don't know. And they could have been experiencing burnout. They could have been experiencing depression. They could have experienced rejection from the church. And they're stepping into that doors willing to try again. I mean, bringing their whole heart with them. And it's scary and it's vulnerable. And we say the ugliest things that person will remember forever.
Yeah. And naturally, it's unintentionally.
Of course. Nobody's out trying to hurt people.
And naturally, each and every one of us is going to make mistakes. But it's learning to think about how one statement can be heard in a different way. I heard mediocre You said you probably said average.
I don't think I would have said you should be mediocre. And I think on top of that, what I said was it's okay to be your average, and your average is better than most people's best.
I actually think that is what you said. But isn't that a good example about how careful we need to be? Because we don't know what someone's going to hear in their most vulnerable stage. So someone saying to you, well, sort of, in your most vulnerable state was just gut-wrenching.
And honestly, at face value, that's not a mean thing to say.
No.
But I was feeling very raw in that moment and taking a chance of stepping back into this community. And then I felt unwanted.
Yeah. So I think that our biggest thing is cope. How do I cope with religion burnout? Seek the joy, but also be understanding to those around us.
Be tender.
Be tender.
With yourself and others.
Yeah. I love that. Be tender with yourself and others. And I think that's the number one thing that we can use as the takeaway. Maybe we should all write that in big letters somewhere on our mirrors so that we start each day with be tender with yourself and others.
So these are some good lessons that you've learned. Looking back on your burnout journey, is there anything that you wish you knew earlier that you now know as a result of that burnout?
One of the things my coach had me do is, and first of all, I want to say I'm in my 60s. So one of the things my coach had me do is write a list of what I saw as my gifts. I'm not talking about spiritual gifts. I'm not talking about talents. He asked me to write a list of what I consider my gifts and start it with I am. And I think that's an exercise I wish I had done over and over and over again, because it was very empowering and freeing, and it let me recognize God loves me for who I am. And so I thought that was a really powerful exercise that I wish somebody had told me, that anytime you start feeling like you're spiraling a little bit, sit down and write down the gifts God has given you.
Do you still do that?
I have done it a couple of times. It becomes, I don't have to write it anymore. I have a voice in my head. So what I wrote then was, I am competent. I am capable. I am a leader. I am sociable. I am loved. And then I also wrote down things about God's love. And so it was helpful. It was helpful for me to recognize that I am loved. I didn't write, I had originally written down, I get things done. And I took that off because that was putting pressure on myself.
Mm-hmm. And that's not who you are.
And that's not who I am.
That's what you do.
That's what I do, again. And so it was like, I'm happy. I wrote down, I'm happy. I love to smile. I love to laugh. And so things like that were helpful to me, because we can spend a lot of energy getting caught up in what we're not.
I was given a similar assignment from my therapist, which actually really helped me a lot with my disillusionment of, God and the church, which went to my burnout spiral. But he told me to make a list of everything that you wish God was. Who do you wish God was? And I would say things like, I wish God was understanding. I wish God was compassionate. I wish God was, all of these different things. I think I said, I wish God was a woman as one of them. And when I came back to my therapy session, we walked through my list, and he says, everything that you wish God was, God is.
Yeah.
That is who God is. All of these characteristics that you wish for God. And it helped. It's kind of an anchoring reminder of like, when I get disillusioned with the church, with people. I feel like everything's going wrong. It centers me back into, but I know who my God is.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. I also think there's an exercise that, again, seems so simple to some people, but was really eye-opening for me that I don't think we talk about enough, and that's just the act of breathing in God's love and presence and breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. I think that's a really powerful image of just, that can be your solitude time, is just focusing on your breath. Specifically, I worked on breathing. When I would breathe in, I would be thinking about being made in God's image. When I breathed out, because I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, anybody that knows anything about Enneagram, I would breathe out, I am not a persona. I am made in God's image, but I'm not a persona.
Yeah.
And to me, that was really helpful to let go of the things I'm not, but breathe in what I am.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been really helpful. And thank you so much for bringing your honesty and vulnerability. I think that sometimes, as a person who works for the church, it can be hard to talk about burnout like this because you're kind of revealing the underbelly of the church a little bit. But the truth is, the church is made up of people, and we're human, and we struggle, and we make mistakes, and we're not perfect. And I think that sometimes we hold ourselves to this impossible standard of, we are supposed to be the image of Christ to the world. And oh my gosh, talk about pressure. Like, of course that would lead to burnout. Of course that would lead to unmet expectations and disappointment. And so I think, if we go back to be tender with yourself, be tender with other people, we can get through this burnout together.
Yeah. And this last thought for me is, you don't have to make your life count for God, because guess what? Your life already counts for God. You already matter. You're already loved. And in a weird way, people that live into I count, I matter, God loves me, they're the ones that are making a difference for God. And they might be making the difference for God from their living room, in their neighborhood, at the sports field. It's not this go, 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 end up in a foreign country, do. It's not that. It's be quiet, recognize God loves you, and live into it.
The Life Plus God podcast is hosted, written, and produced by me, Alyssa Robinson, and sponsored by Treach Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. If you live in the Flower Mound area, I invite you to stop by and see if Treach could be your new church family. You can learn more about all of our programs and events at tmumc.org, and I hope to catch you next week for our next episode of the Life Plus God podcast.